go. All right, I am now going to turn it over to Don Frew, who is our speaker for this evening, and he is going to share with us about things that go bump in the night.
And what to do about them. Given the subject matter, I feel a bit like we should be gathered around a fire with flashlights rather than around computer screens. But I did my part with a spooky background of the baboon catacombs of Hermopolis. So during this talk, if you need me to clarify something I just said, by all means, speak up and ask. But if you have a big question or a story to share or something, please save it to the end, as the question you're about to ask may be dealt with by something that's just coming up. So I don't want to get too sidetracked. So my name is Don Frew. I'm High Priest of Coven Trismegiston and been a member of COG since 1983. Most of you who already know me as what? I don't know what that is.
It's fire.
Oh, okay. That's your background?
Yeah.
Oh, you're fire. Oh, so you're gathered around a fire. That's good.
Yes.
Most of you know me as a Wiccan priest or as that interfaith guy or that craft history guy. Up until the first time I did this talk at PantheaCon in 2011, I'd largely kept my involvement with hauntings out of the Wiccan public eye, but actually I was a professional consultant on the occult for many years before I was known in the craft community. This used to be my business card. This led to working with law enforcement on dealing with the satanic hysteria and the publication of the book Satanism in America, which now the internet has rendered basically useless because all of the people that we debunked back then as being bad sources of information are all over the internet. So who reads books these days? Bury that. However, when I was doing the consulting business, I was very often called upon to deal with hauntings. In fact, that ended up being the majority of the cases that were brought to me. I suppose this shouldn't have been a surprise, given that my family moved into a haunted house in Hillsborough, California in 1973, when I was 13 years old. I'd heard strange sounds around in the closet in my bedroom for months before I saw anything. And I had a large bedroom at one end of the house with two walk-in closets. And there were just sort of sounds of rumbling, movement in one of the closets. And then one night, as I was sort of dozing off, a figure walked out of the closet. And it was a tall man, very gaunt, in a suit. And he walked over the bed and leaned over and looked down at me, and then turned and walked down the hall and vanished. That happened many times during the course of my youth or my childhood. And this is probably what we used to call a film loop. It's now called a residual haunt, in that it's something that's repetitive. And we'll come back to that. I shared the story with my mother, and it turned out that she'd had a bunch of strange experiences of hearing somebody walking down the hall into her bedroom and then feeling someone sitting on the edge of her bed. And she never saw anyone. And she always interpreted this as being her mother and felt it to be a very comforting presence. But then when I moved away to college and she was living in the house by herself, things got stranger. She came home one day to find our dog locked in the bathroom. She came one day, walked into the house, and as she was coming in from the back door from the parking area, walked into the front of the house, and the front door was swinging shut. And looked out, there was no one there. She would wake up in the morning and discover that all the furniture downstairs had been moved, not by much, just by like that much, but enough that you could see where the indentation in the carpet had been, and the furniture wasn't there anymore. When she got more infirm later in her life and she had to have live-in help, she couldn't live upstairs anymore, and so she lived in a guest bedroom downstairs, and the young ladies who helped her lived there. And I discovered after a while that they wouldn't go upstairs. If she sent them upstairs to get something, they'd like sort of dash up, get it, and run down again, because they thought there was something upstairs, and it creeped them out too much. So finally, at the very end of my mother's life, the night before she died, a door chime that we had in the main hall that had been broken since my family had lived there rang at 11 p.m. Freaked the girls out that were taking care of her no end. The next night, my mother died at 11 p.m. I don't know what it was. To this day, I have no idea. No idea about anybody who lived in the house who died. But I have also not had the opportunity to talk to the recent owners who bought it from us to see if they've experienced anything. It's not something you really broach when you're selling a house, you know? So, and in some cases, in some states, it can be an issue that if someone died in the house, you have to report it. Or if the house has a reputation for being haunted, you have to report it. So we never brought it up, and I haven't had the chance to speak with them about it. So let's start by defining a term. As I use it here, a haunting is a location, usually, sometimes a person or object, having a reputation for being a focus for repeated manifestations of psychic phenomena. Notice that this is avoiding the judgment of whether the cause is natural or supernatural until it's been investigated. Lots of places are haunted. They may not end up having a supernatural phenomenon behind it. This talk is about the kind of things that can cause a haunting and what you can do about them. It's not about what used to be called parapsychology and now is called ghost hunting. Ghost hunters, by and large, look for proof of the supernatural, except the proof they come up with is never such as would pass muster as scientific evidence. In the process of looking for proof, they often engage in activities that are morally questionable and likely to aggravate rather than alleviate a haunting. They often use technological equipment in ways for which the tech was not designed and based on assumptions about metaphysical reality that are unproven at best. They usually operate from very narrow paradigms of metaphysical reality, often a Christian one that allows only for ghosts or demons as the types of non-corporeal entities. And while they sometimes are able to explain away a haunting as being caused by natural phenomena, more often than not, they come up with a result that confirms what their clients already knew. Yep, your place is haunted, and then leave the clients to deal with the situation. As a result, I tend to have a somewhat jaundiced view of popular ghost hunting and ghost hunting programs as being primarily rooted in folks looking for pseudoscientific validation of their own experiences of the paranormal, but within narrow, predetermined metaphysical worldviews. A subtitle to this talk might be What to Do After the Ghost Hunters Leave. Also, I recognize the limitations of our ability to know just what these creatures are that are behind some of these hauntings. And so I focus on categorizing things by their appearances and behaviors rather than cosmological categories or hierarchies. I started investigating hauntings professionally in 1978 as part of the business as a consulting occultist and sorcerer. I provided accurate information on the occult for novelists and screenplay writers, consulted on ritual crime for law enforcement, from local police to the FBI, advised folks who believed they'd been cursed, and I investigated hauntings. And these last cases, by the time I was called in, it was usually by people who had already exhausted the more mundane means available to them, knew they had something paranormal going on, and now wanted something done about their problem. I was coming in as a sorcerer, later as a witch, not as a parapsychologist. This talk represents a summary of what I've encountered and what has worked in resolving hauntings to my own satisfaction and that of my clients. In organizing this information, I'm coming from the assumption that either you or someone known to you is experiencing a haunting, or that it has fallen to you to do something about it, or you're just curious about the subject. Further, at an event for Wednesdays with Witches, I feel I can make the assumption that most of you are witches of some form of pagan or magician. If not, I trust you'll be able to translate some of my terminology into your own paradigm and understand that my own Wiccan jargon in no way suggests that any other path is deficient or found wanting. The first step in doing something about a haunting is determining what is really going on. We start with the preliminaries, investigating what's being reported. This always starts with interviews, especially circumstances surrounding the manifestations. What was the time of day? What was the weather like? What are the personal relationships of the people who were present and experienced the phenomenon? What is the personal and environmental context for the haunting? Second is research. Old school, libraries, newspapers, things like that. Are there documents that back up the haunting? A lot of times there's all sorts of stories that people will tell about a place, but when you go and look it up, there's nothing in the historical record that backs up the story. Oh, a guy was hung from that tree. Really? Nothing that supports that. More modern sources, of course, the internet and social media. What are people saying about the place? Why does it have a reputation for being haunted? Talk to the neighbors, but keep in mind privacy concerns, which still apply to some of the stories I'm going to share today. And property values. A reputation for being haunted must be declared to property home buyers in some states. If it adversely affects property values, a blabbing investigator can end up looking at litigation. Then personal on-site investigation. First thing, always take notes. Second, it's always good to work with at least one partner. This is important for perception comparisons so that you can say, okay, I see something in this room. Do you see something and I'm going to note it down. Do you see something in this room? So that it's not just one person's perceptions, but something that you can compare and validate. This also really helps you stay calm. If you're walking around a place with a reputation for being haunted, especially if you're there after hours, you're always thinking that there's something behind you. You're always thinking there's something looking at you. And if you know there's another pair of eyes looking behind you, that can really help with keeping you calm. Investigate the situation both by day and at the same time and conditions as reported in the hauntings. Do it by day to get the lay of the land, recognize shapes and objects so that when in the dark, you go, what is that strange shape over there? Well, you know what it is. And also, so you're not stumbling over things in the dark. So don't just, show up at night to do something. Check it out first during the day. Also check it out during the same time and conditions that the manifestation is reported to increase the chance of encountering what's being reported. If something shows up every day at noon, showing up at midnight isn't going to do jack. Also, I highly question this thing we will often hear in the TV shows where you say, let's go lights out or go dark. This looks great for television, but the possible occult advantage that maybe things are more likely to happen in the dark or maybe more likely to happen by moonlight is completely outweighed by the definite anthropological disadvantages of working in the dark. There are two things that are hardwired into us. One is ascription of agency. If we hear a sound, that sound must have been made by something. And the other is pareidolia, which is making patterns out of random images, like seeing faces in clouds. These were very useful tools when we were huddled around a fire worried about saber-toothed cats. There was no downside to being wrong about ascription of agency or pareidolia. But if you were right, it could save your life. So it's hardwired into us. We will do this all the time. So it's something you have to be on guard against. Stillness can be more of a boon than darkness. Going into a place, just sitting still, letting things happen. And don't expect intermittent phenomena, which would show up on a single night a year, a couple of times a year, to show up when you're there. For instance, in my house, the figure that would come out of the closet 2 or 3 times a year, something like that, and not on any regular schedule. So if someone showed up to investigate that, the likelihood that it would happen the night that they were there is pretty slim. For a lot of these places, you may need to plan to be there several times to investigate, especially to try to match the pattern, if any, of what's being reported. And I cannot stress enough the importance of having a cold investigator. If you can have more than one person there, have someone who knows absolutely nothing about the case. You have no idea what's supposed to happen, because they're always going to be a check on your perceptions. And they're better than having an extra piece of equipment, in my opinion. I would argue against using ghost tech. For one thing, it's really expensive. For another, this is mostly to obtain proof. And I think for what we're doing there, proof isn't really the issue. And who are you going to prove it to? Maybe it'll prove it to you that you've got something, that you had a perception and you got it on a dial that went ping. But that's about it. These tools are rarely calibrated correctly and rarely used correctly. Like you'll see someone walking around with something that's supposed to be lying still on a surface. The popular ones include EMF detectors. Now, EMF detectors detect, electromagnetic fields, detect artificial EMF only. They don't detect geomagnetic anomalies. So if there is something strange and electromagnetic going on there, an EMF detector may not pick it up. There's a specialized type of EMF detector called a K2 device. It's more sensitive in some of the more common ranges, 1.5 to about 20, what's it called? MG, I'm forgetting what it's the abbreviation for, and 30 to 20 kilohertz.
Milligauss?
Thank you. It's basically an EMF detector with flashing lights, and it needs to be read in 3 axes. They're really easy to influence. I once saw a ghost hunting show where someone had a device in their hand and nothing was happening. And someone said, well, I'm going to check in with the base. And they picked up their cell phone and called. And the other person said, the device is going off. And then, oh my goodness, and stopped their call. And they said, it's settled down now. And they kept having this go on and off, that every time they went to pick up their cell phone, the device went crazy. And no one seemed to think, well, maybe it's the device. Maybe it's the cell phone that's setting off the device. You know, these sensitive ones are really easy to influence. Thermal imagers might be interesting, as it appears that some entities do appear on thermal imagers, but not to the naked eye. But they are expensive. Digital recorders are used to do EVPs, or electronic voice phenomena. I find these to be rarely useful, as they're most often garbled, but sometimes you can get a dramatically clear message through. The problem here is that even a crystal clear EVP is not very useful for communication, since you're not going to hear it at the time. You're going to hear it later when you review your recordings of what happened. There's something akin to that called a spirit box, which is basically runs through a bunch of radio frequencies, sort of quickly and rapidly, and just sort of stops on picking up individual words. And it's real easy to have just sort of garbled stuff come out of this and just hear things and hear what you want to hear, just like with an EVP. It's the same approach, the same thing that happens often with a Ouija board. Is people using Ouija boards will have several people working and try to get the planchette to say something. And too quickly, because they want a quick answer, they'll drop into going for yes or no. It's real easy for a group of people without meaning to push a planchette toward yes or to no. If it has to spell out someone's name, that's a lot more work. So if you can avoid dropping into yes or no, a Ouija board can be a useful tool, especially if you have a cold person who's not involved in using it. I'll come back to that. Or actually, no, let me mention it now. If you can actually have an extra person, a cold person, you have several people using a Ouija board, have someone go and look in another room and ask a question about something there and see if you can get an answer. If whatever is giving you amazing answers about their past life or when they lived in the house during Victorian times can't tell you what's in the other room, it's probably your imagination coming through on the Ouija board. So it's really good to have tests for things like this. Now, people working with the Spirit Box came up with an interesting approach called the Estes method that I have found to be very, very interesting. And that's to have someone who is blindfolded, hopefully effectively, and is wearing earphones and is listening to this very annoying Spirit Box that's cycling through all of these radio channels and just sort of spitting out random words. And have other people ask questions. Now, theoretically, the person who's wearing the equipment cannot hear the questions that are being asked. And all they're doing is just sitting there listening. And when they hear this random word say something like, dog, Farquhar, upside down, they're just saying what they're hearing. And I have seen cases where, in fact, what the person said seemed remarkably connected to the questions that were being asked. But that's a good use of a Spirit Box with a control. Otherwise, I think they're really kind of a waste of time. I would not use cameras yourself because I think they disconnect you from the environment, but stationary cameras can be handy. Sometimes things will show up on stationary cameras. But be wary of setting up things like lots of cameras, lots of detectors in places that are using lots of power and introducing electromagnetic fields into areas where they weren't before and could further screw up your investigation. So since the goal of our type of investigation is to determine what's going on rather than to gather proof, I think that most of the ghost tech is more trouble and more dollars than it's worth. All in all, having another investigator would be a more helpful thing. And remember, you're a witch or a druid or a Save Kona or a ceremonialist or whatever, and we have tools available to us that most of the ghost hunters don't. Cast a circle. When I use language like that, please translate it into your particular technology. Local spirits tend to be attracted to magical workings. That's one of the reasons that we feel the need to cast a circle in the first place. And this will work in your favor. A circle also establishes your own turf in what is possibly a spirit's home ground. This is definitely to your advantage. Having cast a circle Expand your own psychic senses into the environment. This will be better than any EMF or K2 meter, especially if done with more than one person in using perception comparison. Invite whatever is there to make itself manifest. Specify that it does so outside of your circle. Do this politely but firmly. Or if we might say in some of the traditions, use the wand rather than the athame at first. Do not provoke. This is a technique used by Ghost Adventures and some of the other programs, which is to move things along when they aren't getting results fast enough. This can include insulting, taunting, and daring a spirit to manifest itself. Sometimes even daring a spirit to do damage to the person. Like, if you're so tough, scratch me or push me over, or something like that. I think it's dangerous. I think it's ethically questionable. And I think you can leave a homeowner to deal with a pissed off spirit after the ghost hunters leave. Better to use our tech, the magical kind. Use divination and scrying tools to communicate with the spirit. Use a Ouija board under the circumstances that I just described, avoiding yes-no questions. And you can do a traditional summoning or evocation. I would say that's a last resort, and best done once you have some idea of what you're dealing with, so you know what methods to use. And overall, be patient. Remember, this may take more than one visit. It may take more than one set of circumstances. I'm always stunned at the programs I see on television where people will set up and be in a location for 3 or 4 hours and then pack it in and leave. Most of these places I've spent the whole night, and gone several times. Spent days in locations, unless I was lucky. So be patient. Be ready to go back to a place more than once. So then we're looking at the causes. First group of causes are misperceived or misunderstood natural or mundane phenomena. And the first group of those are biological flora and fauna. And the first group of those is squirrels. Squirrels and branches. It is amazing how much noise small creatures can make. I mean, I used to do a whole different program, Bigfoot hunting, and people would be sure there was a Bigfoot around their camp and turn on a light, and it was deer walking nearby, or it was raccoons. People just have no idea how much noise small creatures can make when there isn't other noise around. So you always have to check for small animals, especially look in attics, look in basements, look inside walls if you can, check for branches that are moving up against a house. Moving into the Bigfoot land, you can get cryptids that are responsible for something else. I was dealing with a situation with Mexican farm workers that were talking about a spirit. Turned out they were leaving offerings for a forest spirit. It turned out where they were leaving the offerings for the forest spirit, other people were encountering a Bigfoot. And I sort of went, this is a whole different thing. This is a Bigfoot case. This is not a ghost case. So know when it's appropriate to hand things off to specialists in other fields. It's good to look at the physics and the engineering that can be behind hauntings. Houses settle. When they settle, they create strange phenomena. If the house especially has wood floors or wood stairs, there's a domino effect that can happen where, like in the evening, say when temperature changes, wood in a stairway will adjust and make a knock sound. And that releases the stair next to it. And it shifts and makes a knock sound. And that releases the stair next to it, and it shifts and makes a knock sound. And now you've got what appears to be stair steps going up a staircase. But it's entirely wood. Hollow walls create resonant cavities where something like a clock ticking can pass through a house and sound like something bigger than what it is. Curved walls and round rooms create all sorts of wonderful sound effects. I was once at a COG Grand Council in New Mexico in a geodesic dome, and sitting on the opposite side of the dome from Amber and Azrael. And Anna and I noticed that we heard this sound behind us, and we turned, goes, that's Amber's voice. And that we were hearing them on the other side of the dome because we happened to be in exactly the sweet spot for the reflecting sound. And so we just turned and went, Amber, it's us, Amber. Sort of made little voices to her until she started looking around. And then we started playing with it, and having fun. But curved walls and round rooms can create all sorts of strange sound effects. And then there is a strange aspect to EMF to bring up, and this did come from the Ghost Hunters TV show, the first real big ghost hunting show. The guys that did it were plumbers, and they were really good at finding things having to do with plumbing and electrical wiring. And they pointed out something in a basement that they called a fear cage. He said that when you had bad wiring surrounding an area, you could get a weird EMF field that people would experience as sort of a prickling on the back of their neck, a feeling of being watched, an anxious feeling, things like that, that appear to be purely a physiological response to electromagnetic fields. But it can create what they called a fear cage, which is a closed area in which people have these feelings. And so when you have that phenomenon, you need to look at things like wiring to see if that's a possibility. Then we have optical illusions. One of the most famous ones is the specter of the Brocken, which was on a mountain called the Brocken in Germany. I believe Night on Bald Mountain is based on this space. And the people would see a figure of a human in the fog, in the mist, and it was being projected from the people on the mountain outwards onto the fog as sort of a shadow onto the mist. And at my house, which, like I said, I do believe was haunted, there was a phenomenon next to it that we called the running man, which is there was a place when you were coming up the street, which was kind of cobblestony, and there was a curve in the hedge. And when it was damp after a rain, the headlights from a car would hit the cobbles, bounce off onto the hedge, and create a shimmering figure that would move as the car moved up the street. And the first time we saw it, it looked, there's somebody running up the street. And then we realized it wasn't someone running up the street. And the next couple of times we went, what the hell is that running up the street? And stopping the car, the image stopped. And we went, okay, back up, move forwards. We can see what it is. It's a reflection being caused by light bouncing off a wet surface. Old leaded glass windows can do the same thing. They'll have imperfections in the glass that can create weird refractions when light comes through it from outside and then is projected onto a wall. Orbs, which show up sometimes to the eye, but mostly on film, I think are largely a phenomenon of dust in the air. I was in a set of lava tubes under Mount Shasta once that people said, oh, these lava tubes up here, they're supposed to be haunted. And okay, let's go check them out. We went up there and took lots of photos. It was very damp in the lava tubes, I noticed, underground. And we had the very disturbing experience of on our way out of the lava tubes coming across a very large set of mountain lion tracks coming inwards that we realized was now somewhere in the tubes with us. But we didn't see it before we left. But when we developed our photographs, my God, there were orbs everywhere, and even things that looked like a giant tentacle reaching out towards us. And we said, this is mist. This is just the dampness in the air with lots and lots of water particles and the flash bouncing off them and looking like there's something there. But that kind of light reflection can very easily create orbs, both in motion and in still pictures. And then you can get really weird and surprising combinations of all of the above. Things you would never believe were possible. Say, oh no, come on, that can't be. There's a place near the Bay Area called Red, White, and Blue Beach. It's a popular nude beach hangout. You have to pay to go in. It's mostly hanging out older people that are there. And there are a couple of different things that are supposed to be haunted about this beach. And one of them was that people would report seeing a house up on the hill, and people inside the house like having dinner. And then the next day the house would be gone. And it was supposed to be a ghostly house. And it was reported in books, the hauntings of Red, White, and Blue Beach. One of them was the disappearing ghostly house. And Gus and I were there once. We stayed there for a weekend or an overnight, and she said, let's go check this place out. And we were walking down the beach in the evening, and we saw the house. We saw a bright window up in the hillside with people moving back and forth inside it. We just get, that can't be. That's just too good. I'm sorry. We just couldn't believe it. And so we just made a note of it. And the next day in daylight, we hiked up to where this house had been. And we discovered once we hiked up there that we crested sort of a little berm, and we were at a pullout from Highway 1. And there was nothing there. But while we were there, a car pulled in, pulling a mobile home behind it, and they pulled into that pullout to park for the night. And we went, okay, these park for the people don't see it there during the day. It's there at night. People see a window up on the hillside. The next morning when they go out, the people have left and they don't see anything. They don't see that there's a turnout there. They just see that the window of the house that they saw is gone. So that's it. That's the explanation. Simple explanation, but so nuts that if somebody said, oh, it's probably a car pulling up, you'd never believe it. You'd never think that was it. So really strange, complicated mixes of all of these mundane phenomena can create some fairly fascinating things. Then you get to the unusual phenomenon of the hoax, which is the source of almost every Scooby-Doo plot. You know, somebody's trying to scare people away from their gold mine or whatever. This very often can be kids hanging out at their favorite hangout and doing something to make it look scary for other people. But these things can get strangely combined, because if a place has a more serious haunting, it can get a reputation for being haunted, can then become a teenage hangout and become a dare spot for younger kids and for legend tripping. So you can get both younger people hanging out, making things look spooky, and an actual haunting overlapping. Sometimes you get the phenomenon of adults with a financial interest. There is a belief that at least part of the disappearances around the Lost Dutchman mine and the stories around the Lost Dutchman mine are the many people looking for treasure up there, trying to scare other people away from it. There's also tourist traps that are only too happy to build on this. For example, the Whaley Mansion is a site in San Diego, and it is known for being one of the most haunted places in the United States. Almost every place you ever encounter is one of the most haunted whatever in whatever place it is. And one of the things that they have posted there are photographs taken by visitors of people in period costumes sort of floating in the air, transparent women usually in period costumes sort of floating in the air. And that's part of the evidence of the ghosts that they have there. And while I was there, I noticed two things, well, three eventually. One was that the docents were all dressed in period costume. The second was that they did this very interesting thing, that there were several rooms that were decked out in historical form with, clothes and laid out in beds and appropriate bed linens and furniture and everything else. And they made sort of glass boxes that extended from the doorway out into the room so that you could step into the room and look around. And while I was there, I caught a reflection of one of the docents at the top of the stairs in the glass. And because she was in the glass behind me, it's a 3D effect that was often used in theater. She looked like she was further in the room. And I sort of went, of course. People take photos of the room. They don't notice that that's there at the time. Then they look later and they see the reflection of the docent looking like a figure, hovering in the room. And they think they've seen a ghost or photographed a ghost. I'm sure the Whaley Mansion knows that's what's going on. But they're only too happy to post those photographs. And by the way, the Whaley Mansion house has had such a reputation for being haunted for so long, I have no idea if it really is or not. But they definitely are taking advantage of the reputation and taking advantage of tourists encountering this phenomenon to promote it. There's a place near the Bay Area called Moss Beach Distillery, which also had a reputation for being haunted by a blue lady for many, many years. And the owners caught wise to that and started adapting the place to produce ghosts. They started putting things inside mirrors behind them so that when people changed the lighting, it looked like you were seeing a face looking back at you. They started creating little vents in places so that a cold breeze they could make blow on people at various times, all to enhance the effect, because it sold. So yeah, there are people with a financial interest in making these things real. The Santa Cruz Mystery Spot, and there's many mystery spots around the country, and they're pretty much all optical illusions that people do for, to make money. So there are people out there perfectly willing to make money off the paranormal. So compound all of these with the emotion of the moment, somebody thinking suddenly they've encountered something, people's expectations of what they think they're supposed to encounter, flawed memory later of what they did encounter, and the stress of living with a haunting. People who actually do live with something you have to deal with years of no one believes me. That can definitely have an effect on someone. So all of these things have to be sorted through. You can have genuine paranormal event and all of the above. So trying to sort through all of this can be very, very complicated. So let's get to the real thing, so to speak. Causes, ghosts in the broad and the narrow sense. In the broad sense, and this is my first use of the broad sense, I'm going to put this in the chat because people are going to say, could you put that in the chat? apparently non-sentient, non-responding phenomena. These usually, they don't give any indication of actually having intelligence, and they don't seem to respond to anything around them. These can be the result of several things. One is, I would call, involuntary psychometry, which is when a sensitive person picks up on a dramatic event. Some people will be sensitive to it, other people won't. Anton LaVey, who was a friend of mine when he was alive, used to check out haunted places. And one time when I was asking him about places to go look at in San Francisco, he said, you know, back of the San Francisco Zoo, there's an old entrance that's not in use anymore. Go tell me what you think of it. And so I went with a couple of friends, and we all got just an incredible experience of sort of dread and fear there. Not us being afraid, but someone being afraid, of terror. And when I told him about this, he said there had been a particularly vicious rape in this entrance. It was a tunnel going from the zoo out to a parking area under a road. And that afterwards, lots of people had reported feeling really, really bad in that place, such that people didn't want to use it. And they eventually just closed it off and stopped using it. That's just a feeling. There's nothing else there, I don't think. There's just a feeling. And I think someone who wasn't psychically sensitive probably wouldn't pick up on it. But it's nothing more than that. Then you get what T.C. Lethbridge called the etheric film segment, and is now called people call a residual haunt. This is characterized by repetitive behavior. A typical behavior will often include doing something like walking through a wall or walking up the air. And this can often be found to correspond with, there was an opening here that's not there anymore, but the thing is still walking that path. Or there was a stairway here that's not there anymore, and so the thing is still walking up that path, even though the stairs aren't there. Lethbridge identified several factors contributing to this, which seem to be true of most of these situations. The willpower of the original source, the sensitivity of the viewer, the emotional intensity of the situation, the location of the site in relation to things like ley lines and such, and the practice of magic. All of these things seem to lead to, I'm using cautious language on all of this, seem to lead to an increased likelihood to imprint a film strip. Again, it doesn't appear that there's anybody there. It's just a repeating image. A friend of mine who worked in a brothel in Oakland said that they had a problem of a man who ran down the hall some nights. That's all he did. He just ran down the hall and disappeared. Then didn't say anything, didn't do anything else, just ran down the hall. People would try to interact with him, would stand in his way. It didn't make any difference. I was never able to confirm that myself. It was just reported to me. The ghost in my house seemed like it was one of these. It did the same repetitive motion. Came out of the closet, walked over to the bed, looked down, walked down the hall. That was it. Notice it didn't matter whether the door to the closet was open or not. It still just walked out of the closet. I had a ghost in the closet. These ghosts especially tend to be indistinguishable from living people, in that people who are encountering them don't know it's a ghost until it does something like walk through a wall or disappear right in front of them. But that's one of the things that characterizes them, is that they look completely real. Now, in the broad sense, the second meaning, I'll put this one in the chat too. Copy, let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see, bad me. I didn't click return on the first one. Oh, there you go. Trying to do too many things at the same time. There you go. The second one, apparently sentient responding phenomenon that are seemingly caused by living usually present people. One form of this is suggestion plus telepathy equaling a group illusion. This is essentially the same thing as a thought form, but unintended. We're talking in some ways like a glorified Ouija board spirit. And if intentional, the Philip experiment. Some of you may have heard of the Philip experiment. This was done in 1972 in Toronto, and a book was written about it called Conjuring Up Philip by Iris Owen. And a group of people interested in the subject said, well, people are contacting spirits by the Ouija board and such. What if we invented someone? Let's make up someone. And they made up Philip. And they said, here's Philip's name, here's where Philip was born, here's his past, here's how he died. And they, basically invented someone. And then they set about doing seances with Philip. And they used Ouija boards, which produced remarkable results with Philip talking to them. They asked Philip to produce physical responses, and he did, like table rapping and people feeling him touching them and moving objects. It was a pretty phenomenal thing, but Philip was entirely imaginary. So it is possible for living people to create something that then others might encounter as a ghost. There's also the classic poltergeist phenomenon. Now, these are usually of short duration, like in the form of months, rarely longer than that. They are characterized by physical effects, often dramatic and energetic. There was someone who I was dealing with on the phone, and the opportunity for me to visit her place stopped. She stopped pursuing it with me. I was unfortunate because she was telling me about escalating phenomenon. The last thing she was telling me about was kitchen knives flying across the room. And I was very, very concerned at that point. But she stopped communicating with me. So I don't know. I never got the chance to actually go investigate. So I don't know what the cause was. These are often person-focused. There is some evidence that objects will move around that person in a spiral field. And there is a stereotype that they are connected with an adolescent girl. Now, I think that is probably projection on the part of the elder male investigators. But that was the claim, is that it was, pubescent, adolescent girls, and, probably could be adolescents in general. But the stereotype in the literature is girls. But the phenomenon are characterized by physical objects in motion, often in spurts, dramatically energetic, and often moving, if the focusing person is me, moving sort of from my side, sort of around in front of me and off to the side, something like that, in sort of a spiral around the person. Those often resolve themselves as the person in question gets older. So, and for a while, people will think that they have something else from outside haunting. And it's not that. It's basically just a manifestation, unconscious manifestation of psychokinesis, as far as we can tell. So, and then the third broad sense, which is other ghost-like or ghost-adjacent phenomenon, is what I'm calling it. And hit there we go. There's a lot of strange things out there that can be, appear to be ghosts. One is the phenomenon of obsession. This is when a person is mentally obsessed with another living person, which can just be a mental difficulty, an instability that needs to be resolved. But it can be the result of a spell or a curse or something else that needs to be resolved. There can also be an obsession with a dead person. I sometimes would say fandom gone horribly wrong. I knew someone who was working with the poet Lord Byron, and I'm not going to, it wasn't actually Lord Byron, but I'm not going to go into it, protect the person, but was working with Lord Byron. And in doing so, became not just, read all the poetry, read about the person's life and such, but started feeling like, I feel that person's presence in my life around me. And that moved to the person's in my dreams. And that moved to, I can hear the person talking to me. That moved to, I need to ask them before I do something. That moved to, what should I have for dinner? It became more and more obsessive. And the dead person, took more and more control of the living person's life. Was it the actual dead person? Was it just a link between the living person and the person in the past in some way? I don't know. I can tell you what the phenomenon was, what the effect was. And it was one of obsession. And it was one that needed to be broken. And fortunately, over time, this person was able to get enough distance from Lord Byron, especially through the assistance of friends, to eventually break the connection. Some people can become obsessed by a past life and let a past life that they believe they've had take over their current life. Obsession, is on the borderline between paranormal phenomenon and mental instability. And there's no reason things can't be both. Not at all. There's a strange phenomenon that is sometimes called temporal telepathy. And that's when someone has the experience of moving through time. But it's a lot easier to think that someone is in some sort of mental connection with the past than to think that they physically moved through time. And the most famous case of this is sometimes called the 1901 Versailles time slip, or the Moberly-Jourdain incident. And some people know it as the ghosts of the Petit Trianon. This happened in 1901 when two women, Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jourdain, one of whom was the head of a college and the other was a teacher there in England, who visited the Versailles on vacation, and were walking through Versailles, through the gardens, and had the strange experience of sort of feeling kind of otherworldly, and then encountering people in period costume. And they thought, oh, well, there's a play going on or something like that. And they spoke to people, and they encountered a woman who was in very elaborate dress, appearing to be Marie Antoinette, sitting on the grass eating cakes. But the whole thing had a very sort of otherworldly nature to it. Afterwards, they didn't talk to each other about it. They both wrote about it to themselves in their own diaries, but they didn't talk about it. When they eventually talked about it, they realized that they both had a feeling of something being very otherworldly, and they decided to look into it. They discovered that the paths that they had both noted that they'd walked down didn't exist. They went back and couldn't find them. They weren't there. And it was only years later that when renovation was being done on a house in Paris, that a wall was opened and a map was discovered in the wall that was of plans for a redesign of the garden at Versailles. And it showed the paths that the women had walked down. And it appears that for at least a short period of time, shortly before the revolution, the gardens did look like that. So it looks like they made some connection with the past. They connected with people there. They spoke with people there, or appeared to. But I think it's far more likely, like I said, that it was some kind of mental connection. But they perceived it as a time slip. They perceived it as having traveled through time. So they then wondered for a while, were they encountering the ghosts of people from the past? Other people were walking through the gardens at that time and didn't encounter anything. So I think it's more likely a mental encounter. Then you can also get the astral form of a living person. And this was a common experience reported about monks, that they would be deep in prayer and then be seen somewhere else doing something. Might also be what's described in some communities as skinwalkers. Someone who has their physical form as one place, but they're moving around in another form someplace else. So moving to ghosts in the more narrow sense of what people tend to mean when they say ghosts. Click, there we go. Apparently sentient, responding phenomena, seemingly caused by a dead person that is present at the time, or at least partially present. There are several forms of these that appear. One is the incomplete ghost, not an incomplete body, like, it was a partial apparition or whatever they used to say in Ghostbusters, but an incomplete consciousness. These entities look like people, again, but they have purpose, intent. They seem to be concerned about something. They often resemble a residual haunt, except that you can like interrupt them. You can get their attention. They're often upset about something. They can respond within narrow parameters. They can vary their behavior. They can sometimes be spoken with, sometimes not. They seem irrational. They often don't know they're dead, which is a sort of cliched phrase. They actually can't process that they're dead, or don't seem to care when that's pointed out to them. It's not like, oh my God, I'm dead? What? No, it just doesn't mean anything to them. This is possibly the irrational soul of the Neoplatonists, or some part thereof. If what was appearing at my house was my mother's mother, it would be a good example of that. All it did was show up and express concern for my mother. She felt comforted. That was it. You know, it didn't, it felt like it had something left undone. What I think might be more akin to it is if, possibly, is if you died, let's say, and you did leave a task undone, you don't, all of you doesn't have to stay here to finish that task. Just the part concerned with the task needs to work on it. And it's possible that just some part of a consciousness is present, the part that's concerned with the undone task or the unfinished concern. And so it can be interacted with, but it's not all there. Then you get the full-on stereotypical classic ghost. This is, as far as we can tell, it presents itself as an actual deceased person with something resembling full consciousness, often staying with a reason, but you can talk with it about it, can be spoken with, reasoned with, possibly the rational soul of the Neoplatonists or some part thereof. The best example I ever encountered was a friend of a friend. He owned a comic shop in Berkeley. And his, I'm just going to say Bob. I was going to say I have his name here, but if this is being recorded, I'm just going to say Bob, for his own, privacy. And he had a situation at his house where his grandmother had lived in the house and his grandmother had died. And then they were having phenomenon of things moving in the house, setting things down one place and they were being found in another place. People feeling a presence, hearing her voice. Her rocking chair that was in one room was seen rocking of its own volition, or its own, under its own power. They asked me to come in and deal with this. And while I was there on one evening, it manifested. And it manifested as a presence that we all felt that moved through the house and into one room. The one room being her room, which was now being used as a storeroom. And it was piled high full of all sorts of boxes and crap. And her rocking chair started rocking. And I sat down next to her chair and I asked her, I said, this was your room, wasn't it? And I got a very distinct impression of yes. And I said, you're concerned about something. She said, yes. And I said, what is it? And stuff moved. Things around us moved. I sort of went, you'd rather these weren't here, I take it. And then the rocking chair sort of rocked more vigorously. So I went, okay, if we tidied things up here and put things back the way they were when you were living here, would you be satisfied? Would that be okay? And it settled down. The rocking settled down. And I turned to my friend there and I said, would that be okay? If she, would she need to leave? Would you, be willing to set things back the way they were and just let her be here? And they said, yeah, that'd be fine. Now that we know what it is, now that we know it's her and that's all the issue is, sure, no problem. So they tidied things up. She's there now and then. The rocker rocks now and then. No problem. Things aren't thrown around or moved around. So it just seemed like she had the desire to stay, to be around her family, and she wanted her room to be the way it was. And once she got that, she was fine. So a special case of the ghost, the classic ghost, is what's sometimes called the lich or the vampire or the willfully remaining spirit. This is often associated with psychic or actual vampirism. Now, I have only encountered one case of this, and that was in Yugoslavia. And I was traveling with a friend's family, and we were driving down what was considered to be a major highway on our map, which was a 2-lane dirt road that was nicely, graded. It was smooth. And we got to a point, we'd been driving out in the middle of nowhere for hours in the woods, and we got to a point where the traffic was stopped, traffic such as it was. There were cars stopped ahead of us, and we couldn't go any further. And so after a while, we got out of the car to see what was going on. And up ahead of us, we could see a crowd. And there was a crossroads of two roads. The cars were stopped on either of them. And in the middle of the crossroads, there was a group of people standing in a circle. There were Orthodox priests in full regalia, swinging incense and chanting. And in the middle of the crossroads was a hole. And down in the hole was a coffin with a guy in it, with a body in it. And over it was another person with a stake, driving a stake into the heart of the corpse, which is not something you see every day. And we asked what was going on. And they said that this person had died recently. And after he had died, his family started getting sick. And this is probably, if you watch like Learning Channel and Discovery Channel, History Channel, you probably run into these stories. His family started getting sick. They started seemingly wasting away. They were, losing weight and getting gaunt. And people, the local priest suspected vampirism. So they opened this guy's coffin and they said that his hair was growing and his nails were growing, which is something that is not really true, but it appears to be true after death. And he had blood around his mouth. And they decided that he was a vampire. And so they were disposing of him right in the center of the crossroads. And so once they had finished this, the priest splashed holy water over it and they finished their things and people sort of dispersed. And we drove on our merry way right over the top of the vampire. Was he a vampire? I don't know. But that is a case that is what is sometimes referred to as a lich or a vampire, a willfully remaining spirit. Extremely rare. Although when chaos magic became popular, they actually wrote a ritual for doing this, for surviving death and staying longer than you should. And it made me wonder if we were going to start seeing examples, but no, it looks like either people didn't take them up on it or weren't able to pull it off. This goes also behind the idea of hungry ghosts in Asian traditions. Ghosts, in the narrow sense, that I've described above, tend to manifest with one of two common appearances. One is wispy white and sort of semi-transparent. I encountered this in one case where a friend of mine who I grew up with in Hillsborough, his family had a very weird and creepy old house that was riddled with secret passages. And the story was that when it was being built, that the man was building it as a home for he and his wife, and he had a master bedroom for the two of them at one end of the house, and at the other end was a fancy sort of boudoir bedroom for his wife. And while it was being built, she died, and he was horribly distraught. And while work continued on the house, apparently there were some suspicious deaths. And the story goes that that they had a problem with workers when somebody fell to his death from the rafters, and the people next to him say he was pushed. He didn't just fall. And they lost a bunch of workers. This is the story. I've never been able to confirm it. A friend while this family was out of town, another friend was staying in the house sitting for them and taking care of their two dogs, giant Irish wolfhounds. And one of the dogs died. And so the family was coming back. And this friend called me and said, if you've ever wanted to stay at this house, this is your chance. They're coming back, tomorrow. You have one night if you want to stay. And so I said, sure, I'll take it. So we stayed in the house and we stayed in the grand hall, which is sort of the living room. And I moved some stuff around so that I could do a circle. And my friend knew nothing about any of this. And I said, don't worry about it. I'm going to cast it around where we'll be sleeping on the couches. You don't need to worry about anything. So cast a large circle, invited whatever was present to make itself known, welcomed it, and we and the dogs sort of went to sleep. Nothing until wee hours in the morning when suddenly there's a loud bang that wakes us both up. And it's coming from back where the master bedroom is. And then we hear very clearly footsteps. Now, this is a tile floor, so it has a different effect than a wood floor. Tile floor, walking down the hallway from the master bedroom, walking across the hall where we are, walking up a spiral staircase to a library that overlooked the grand hall, and then back the hallway behind there to where the boudoir bedroom was. And then we heard that door open and shut. It was a big, heavy wooden door. We heard ka-chunk. At that moment, the pots and pans in the kitchen started going nuts. Bangity, 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 bangity. Okay. So I said, we've got to check this out. And my friend said, really? I said, yeah, we got to check this out. So we went, and First looked down the passage to the master bedroom, nothing noticeable. Went up the spiral staircase up to the library, and then there's this little hallway to a door. And just for creep's sake, the door has a big wooden face carved in it. And there's a wonderful mechanism built into it, such that in the mouth, there's a little metal plate, such that when you say open, the P makes the little plate make a contact and the door would open on its own automatically. And we didn't try to do that. The mechanism hadn't worked for years, but the door was shut. And so we opened the door, and standing in the middle of the room was a woman looking kind of like the old Gibson girl image that had sort of the hair all pulled up around her head, white blousey dress, white, white sort of busty top blousey dress, and turned away from us. And semi-transparent, kind of wispy around the edges. And I said to my friend, okay, let's go. And he said, are you crazy? I said, let's go in. He said, I'm not going in there. So I said, what? I'm really not inclined to go in without someone with me, I gotta say. So we backed back out and shut the door behind us. And the next morning, we went back up to open the door and check, and there was nothing that could have made this shape, nothing that could have caused it, except I would suspect that it was the wife. It certainly fits the story, but that was definitely of the wispy white, semi-transparent sort. A good example of the absolutely real type is with my father. Now, my father is about as straight-laced, secular, non-religious, non-supernatural as one could possibly imagine someone to be. He was always kind of disappointed that I went into all of this weird shit. And at one point when I was in college at Berkeley, he came up visiting and we went out to dinner. And over dinner, he started asking me some rather pointed questions. He said, why are ghosts always in spooky houses? I said, well, they're not. They can be in tract homes, things like that. I said, how come ghosts are always scaring people? I said, well, they don't. They do perfectly ordinary things. And he's so this is going somewhere. I couldn't figure out what. And finally, he kind of leaned back in his chair in the restaurant. And he said, I think I saw a ghost once. And I'm like, what? He's never made mention of this. And he said, I was in college and I had a girlfriend and I went to her family's house for dinner. It was 4th of July. And they had a house that was, there was a house, there was a guest house, like one side, and then there was a retaining wall that held up the hillside around the back of the yard. And there was a patio behind the house. And we were barbecuing or something out on the patio, and he was sitting out on the patio and he was having a beer. And everyone went inside. Everyone else, his girlfriend and the parents, went inside to do something. They don't remember what. And he said he turned and he saw a man standing in the doorway to the guest house. And he was wearing slacks and a sort of white shirt, like the kind if you'd come home and taken off your coat and tie and undone a button. Looked like he'd just gotten home from somewhere. And he thought, well, that's funny. They didn't mention that anybody was staying there. And he said, while he was looking, the person walked out onto the patio, turned, walked over to the retaining wall, walked into the wall and vanished. And I said, what did you do? And he said, I looked at the house, I looked at the retaining wall, I looked back at the house, I decided that could not have happened, and went into the house to get another beer. And all this time, he'd never said anything to me. He knew I was interested in all this stuff. He'd never said a thing. He just sort of, that could not have happened. But to him, it looked like a completely live, ordinary person. And those things that present as being ghosts in the sense of being a possibly once living person manifesting, seem to manifest in those two forms: the wispy white, transparent, semi-transparent shape, or the absolutely real shape. Now, what about things other than ghosts? Let's put this one in the whole thing. In other words, apparently non-human haunts. The first group is often characterized as astral creatures or creations. In other words, things inhabiting a world parallel to our own or interpenetrating our own, visible to people with the sight in some way or another, but not to most people. visible with the kind of vision used to see auras. These are, in most cases, as far as I can tell, indigenous flora and fauna of the spirit world. Animals and plant forms minding their own business, no big deal. They can be parasitical. Then they become something that needs to be dealt with. Then there's thought forms, which can get back to that idea like the Philip experiment, can be created by an individual's strong will or by widespread attention. They can be possibly the transition from the small start, like the Philip experiment, through a popular cultural icon to a deity. Gus once posited, he didn't say that this was happened, but he once posited maybe this is how gods get started. I once had probably the weirdest case I've ever had was something that I came to call a literary thought form. It involved a young woman who I will call Astra to protect her. Some of you may know who J. Allen Hynek was. He did Project Blue Book for the government on UFOs. And I was contacted by J. Allen Hynek, and apparently the connection was through Shambhala, I think is how he found me. And he was passing along to me this woman, Astra, who had a very strange connection with aliens through automatic writing, and had moved beyond anything that he could deal with. And he was wanted to hand it off to someone else, and he was handing it off to me. Astra was someone who, as a young woman, had a group of friends who were playing around with a Ouija board. She wasn't interested. The people at the time, the original Battlestar Galactica series was popular. The friends on the Ouija board started saying, well, let's talk to Starbuck, and she had no interest in any of this. And they're going, oh, look, we can talk to Starbuck. And then she joins in with them in this. They go, come on, do it with us. She joins in, and they decide to talk to Luke Skywalker. And they start talking to Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker says something along the lines of, give her some paper. And when they give Astra some paper, she sort of goes into what appears to be a trance and starts writing on the paper, writing furiously, such that they have trouble keeping up with her. When she finishes a page, they have to shove more paper under her, or she would keep writing on the furniture. And she's writing communication with Luke Skywalker, talking to these people. Luke Skywalker, and through Luke Skywalker, she also talks to an entity that's supposedly some version of her in the Star Wars universe. And it was in working with that she'd somehow ended up with J. Allen Hynek. And Hynek was working with people who were channeling aliens and was doing this weird experiment where he was asking each of them what they had to say about the other aliens. And when that didn't really pan off into anything, he decided, and handed it off. So as Astra was talking to Luke Skywalker, this eventually got handed off to Darth Vader. And Darth Vader became a regular part of her life, speaking to her through automatic writing, which always required another person, because somebody else, she'd be gone when she was doing this. Somebody else would have to be there to ask questions, to put paper in front of her to make this work. That's what was the state of things when it got passed off to me. And I'm going, Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker, what the hell? So I was highly skeptical. So at one point, I started wondering, maybe this is like the Philip experiment, but it's a literary figure. Maybe that's what's going on here. So I asked her questions about Spider-Man, say, for example. And she rattled off a bunch of things in the sort of voice of Spider-Man. And I'm going, okay, well, that's easy. Everybody knows Spider-Man. Everybody knows who Spider-Man is. But I had a friend who was active in the comic book industry, and he had a comic book writer named Tim Truman staying at his house. Tim Truman created a character that was well known at the time named Grimjack. Probably not as well known now. But he was the sole creator of this character. So I thought, aha, let's take her over and talk to Truman about Grimjack, because no one else has information about him. There's things that weren't in the comics that no one else knows. So she talks to him, and he starts talking to her about what's in the future of the character. And her, channeling Grimjack, tells him all about it. all about what his plans are for what's coming up with the character. The guy's jaw drops and he gets kind of weirded out and doesn't want any more to do with it. I pursue this a little further, and through connections that I have, there's a science fiction convention coming into town. I arranged for a seance with David Prowse. David Prowse was the actor who played Darth Vader, the tall guy, not the face, not the voice, but the tall guy under the outfit. And the only time I've gone to a science fiction convention, it was to do a seance with David Prowse. So we met in his room with myself and Astra and he was game. He thought this was very interesting. And so we asked her to talk to Darth Vader and for Darth Vader to come through. He started asking Darth Vader things about himself and asking him things about what he thought about the character and things about his house back in England and his plans for a renovation. And every question he asked, Vader answered. And he was stunned, didn't know what to make of it. But all of this process of looking into it seemed to give Vader a stronger and stronger hold, a stronger and stronger connection over Astra's life. And it was becoming unhealthy. And a friend and I, Greg Stafford, who approaches these things more from the shamanic approach, we worked together on sort of saying, you need to break this off. You need to stop doing this. He's dominating your life. And at one point, when we were talking with her about this, and she was sitting on a chair, and we were saying, you've got to break this, you've got to stop this. And we were telling her to say that to him, that he has to leave. And suddenly she was thrown forward off the chair with a scream of pain. And when we picked her up, she was clutching at her back, and we lifted her shirt, and she had a fresh burn mark across her back, tapering about like from this wide down about like that across her back. And the first words he had to write were, "I thought it was time for you to remember what a lightsaber felt like." And we're going, oh, this is bad. So we worked with her both sort of ritually and in a more counseling way to break the connection. And we did, but she didn't really want to let it go. We weren't able to let her let go of it. And so it kept, he stayed in her life. I don't know if it ever got that intense again, but he stayed in her life. And she's moved away and I've lost touch with her. But, that was, I have no way to understand that except as a literary thought form, which suggests that just as a thought form that one might be created through a magical process, an entity that enough people around the world put enough emotion and intensity into can have an independent existence, or at least a relatively independent existence. I would note that Vader never knew anything that the people who, quote, believed in him didn't know. This entity that wrote didn't know how to make a lightsaber, didn't know how a star drive worked, but it knew what David Prowse knew. It knew what other people who were involved in creating Darth Vader knew. So, because I think all of that was being projected into this. But that then does raise the question of how many beings start out that way as some shared upon entity that just gradually gets sort of bigger with a larger community behind it. And where does that go? So in the next group, I would throw into this not being ghosts, but can also be the cause of a haunting. Creatures of the four elements, at least according to traditional European magic. In other places, of course, it could be the five elements or other systems. The elementals have elemental kings. Air is Peralda, fire is Jin, water is Nixa, and earth is Gob. I'm going to pass over some of that. Oh, yeah. Then there's a form of them known as elementaries, which is, I think the best description of them is in Franz Bardon's books, which are the combination of thought forms and the elements. It's basically creating thought forms out of the elements and given limited autonomy. There's all sorts of nature spirits out there, sort of a cross between astral fauna and elementals. These are the ones known as Genius Loci or Genii Lokii, are tied to a particular place. These can be intelligent, although they can be intelligent, they can be not intelligent. I mean, it can really vary when it comes to nature spirits. I've encountered several during my career as a witch, especially those that have ended up being called in the directions and things. But probably the most fascinating was when I was in Taiwan at a meeting of something called the Golden Institute for Interfaith, oh boy, something in peace. I don't remember what it was now. And it was a gathering of interfaith councils from around the world. And we were meeting in Taipei. And our host was Dharma Master Shin Dao, who had quite a following there and had the Museum of World Religions in Taipei. And I ended up going back and taking them an exhibit on Wicca for their museum because they didn't have anything. And he said, oh, we really want something. So I took my first Athame, my first cord, a whole bunch of tools and other things back for them to make an exhibit out of. But while the Golden Institute was meeting in Taipei, he invited us to stay at his monastery, Wusheng Monastery, on a mountain on the north coast of Taiwan called Lingzhou. And they basically owned the top of this mountain, and they had a monastery, and they had temples in various places, and meditation paths going through the woods, and one of the most varied ecosystems of large butterflies anywhere in the world, which was incredible. And so we were staying there, and at one point, the weather was very misty and sort of rainy for the whole time we were there. And on the last day, a fellow interfaith person, the Reverend David Ponadel, who was a Christian and an old friend of mine in interfaith, we had noticed that there was this temple on a hill, sort of a little bit in the distance. We could only barely see it in the fog and through the drizzle. And we said, John, we really would like to check that place out. And they said, well, you better go now because we're going to be heading back to Taiwan or heading back to Taipei soon. You won't have another chance. And David said, but it's raining. I said, well, a while back, I learned a charm for stopping the rain when you really need it to, not for very long. So I said, give me a minute. So and the rain stopped a little bit later, and we went walking off to this hill. And it's a beautiful little Chinese style temple on the top of this hill. And we were alone, the fog was all around us, absolutely gorgeous. And then we sort of felt something off to one side, and we turned and looked, and a deer with glowing antlers came walking out of the mist. And it stood there and just looked at us for a while, sort of turned its head and retreated back into the mist. You're sort of, well, that made our trip. And we went back to the administrative buildings back in the monastery, and the rain started up again, and we got our stuff packed to go. And as we were leaving, I mentioned this to one of the nuns there, and I said, sorry, monastery there means a facility for nuns and a facility for nuns, and they're sharing other buildings together. So, but I mentioned it to one of the nuns, and I said that we'd gone to this temple and we'd had a remarkable experience. And she said, oh, did you meet the guardian of the temple? And she said, well, I don't know. We met a deer. It came out of the mist. She said, glowing, right? He said, yeah, that was it. She said, yes, it's very nice. You're very lucky. She said, he doesn't show himself very often. That means he accepted your being there. So we were very happy. I wrote this up in my regular interfaith reports that I sent home. And the director of the interfaith chapel at the Presidio, who then would forward these on to other interfaith people, said, "Are you sure you want to keep this in there? you don't want to take out this charm stuff?" And I said, that's what we do. So, no, leave it in. So, but he was really kind of weirded out by that. Moving into the stranger and stranger, there is a category of beings. I'm not going to speculate as to what they are, but there's a category of beings that are known as shadow beings. Sometimes used to be called shadow men or shadow beings. This is a name for a category. They are usually humanoid, but not always. They are absolutely black, no discernible features or contours. They are unfriendly to aggressively territorial. They have a painful attack in the form of basically just like touching or reaching into or something, resulting in freezing cold. And this has been reported from lots of different places. I've never heard anybody have a particularly good explanation as to exactly what these things are, but they're reported a lot. There's a place in San Francisco called Corona Heights, and in the 60s there was something called the Creature of Corona Heights, which was apparently one of these things. Fritz Leiber incorporated it into the novel Our Lady of Darkness, but it was long gone by the time I first went there in the 80s. And I don't think anybody's reported anything like that there in decades. So it's an example of how sites can change, and what can be a haunting at one point can dissipate, or one can develop. And another example of a shadow being is back to good old Red, White, and Blue Beach. One of the other hauntings reported there, and Gus is laughing, another haunting reported there is a black figure that appears on the beach and that would come out of the fog. And people would say, oh, and it's the ghost of an old lighthouse keeper or something like that, because it's on a beach, so it must be a lighthouse keeper, or sailor, or whatever. But we were down on the beach walking in the fog, and the fog definitely moved in and engulfed us. And up ahead of us, we saw a dark figure in the fog. And we thought, a humanoid figure ahead of us in the fog. And we thought, look, is that just a shadow? Are we projecting a shadow into the fog? So we walked forward, and it moved forwards, and we walked forward a bit forward, and it moved forward ahead of us. And it was just starting to think it's some sort of optical effect when we walked forward, and it turned and charged at us. And we had just about enough time to sort of basically throw up a shield in front of us when it's, sort of screeched to a stop, just a little ways away from us, and then turned and retreated back into the fog. And we thought, that was very unsettling. And we would imagine that other people encountering this humanoid shape in the fog would go, it's an old lighthouse keeper, it's a sailor, who knows? But it very definitely appeared to be one of these shadow things, and very definitely appeared to be aggressive and territorial, which seems to be one of their hallmarks. I've encountered them on a couple of other occasions, but I'm cognizant of the time I'm looking over, so I'm judging which stories to sort of pass on and which to move on to. And I've noticed that a lot of the TV shows that will talk about strange phenomenon or catch things on film or whatever, shadow beings seem to be showing up a lot. People catching them on film, which is rather weird. But they do seem to be always on the nasty side, which leads us into demonic beings. Now, it doesn't require a Christian paradigm to realize that there are especially nasty spirit beings out there. And I always used to say that if you looked at the movie Aliens, with those nasty bug-like things that were coming at people, they're just ordinary bugs doing what they do. They're not evil. But boy, are they intrinsically ill-disposed towards people, and you don't want them in your backyard. There are nastily evil, or there are nastily ill-disposed things towards humans out there. It's not correct to call them evil, but demonic's as good as anything. They are characterized by nastiness, violence, a seeming real hatred of humans for some reason. Most cultures recognize their existence in one form or another, as well as angelic beings, which seem to be a useful catch-all term for saints, ascended masters, teachers, light beings, all things that seem to be intrinsically well-disposed, seem to have take on a role of guiding or instructing or helping. I think it's a real mistake to call them angels, but they're good things. The mighty ones of the mighty dead, especially elevated ancestors, would be, I think, a good example of this. Many years ago, Anna made contact with a woman named Deonis, who was the last priestess. I guess she's not the last living because Patricia Crowther's out there. But Deonis was one of Gerald Gardner's priestesses who, when she got engaged to a man who was, not Kraft and concerned about all the attention that Kraft was getting, and the two of them got married, they withdrew from Kraft and moved out of the country. And nobody had heard of this woman since. And Anna made contact with her in the 90s, I think it was. She'll correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. And we realized who she was. And in contacting her, we discovered that she'd had no communication with witches since she'd left the craft in 1959. And in fact, she didn't know there were witches out there. As far as she knew, there were 3 covens in England, and that was it. So she was quite stunned. And so we were quite thrilled at the chance to meet her. She came and stayed with us. She let us question her before she was contaminated, which was very nice. But while she was staying with us, we celebrated Samhain. And one of the things that happened while she was here is when she left England and left with Gerald, it happened suddenly, and she was afraid that they'd left badly, because Gerald had sent her a wedding present of 30 pounds sterling. And she had interpreted that as 30 pieces of silver. And so she felt that, things had been really bad. And Anna and I, collecting a trove of Gardnerian historical documents, said to her, well, he certainly didn't sound upset with you in his last letter. And she said, what last letter? And we discovered that we had a letter that Gardner had written that she'd never received. And so, we said, sit down, and we went and got this letter and gave it to her. And it was a very nice letter about how sad he was that she was leaving, but that he'd always think of her as a daughter and really hoped her the best, and all these nice things which she'd never gotten. And so she was crying, and then we were crying, everything. But so a few days later, we celebrated Samhain, and in our Samhain, the high priest, me, becomes possessed by the Lord of the Dead, and then the Lord of the Dead goes and retrieves people's ancestors to come speak with them. And people have food offerings, and they speak either through me or through another method there. And the first person up, when I've been drawn down on, the first person up is Dionys, and she wants to talk to Gerald. And I feel very fortunate that he said, tell her to look to her left. And she looked, and he was standing in the north in our circle. And she was able to speak with him. And about half the coven saw this person standing there, and she was able to speak with him and resolve things. They were able to have a conversation and resolve things, and it was very nice. And one of the things he said was that he was always in the north at Samhain. Interpret that how you will. But he seemed like he had adopted one of these roles of becoming, one of the mighty dead, maybe one of the mighty ones, and was adopting a sort of tutelary, guiding kind of role, at least within the tradition. But I'm sure that there are many, many other mighty dead out there who are looking after the many different downlines that they have in different traditions out there. Then also in this sort of angelic category, there are tradition-specific protectors or guardians. In the Gardnerian tradition, there's a group of beings that I can't discuss at any length, that are protectors, that are they're specifically as guardian figures for the tradition. And our coven was up in the hills here once in Redwood Park. Again, the fog rolls in here. This is one of the characteristics of the Bay Area. We get a lot of fog. The fog rolls in. And we were up in the redwoods, and we were parked off a road through Redwood Park. And there's a path that goes up into the woods, and there were a large redwood platform which people could put tents on, could camp at. And we knew about this place, and we thought it was a great place to do rituals. And so we'd all gone up there. We were out in the park. We were in the fog. We were in robes, had an altar set up. We're ready for ritual. And we hear motorcycles, lots of them. And we're going, oh boy, hope they pass by. And they all pull up into the parking area where we've parked. We're going, oh, great. And we hear the engines dying, and we hear them, getting their stuff. We can hear beers, and they're clearly planning to come up to this platform. And somebody in the group says, what about the guardians? And we sort of, yeah, what about them? And we'd sort of flip through the Book of Shadows, find that part, and we go, okay, and we do this ritual that's supposed to summon them for help. And all of us noted very immediately the fog thickened around us, not in us, but around us. The fog thickened around us. And as the voices grew closer, like 20 feet grew closer, we could hear people saying, it's got to be up here. We know it's up here. Where is it? It should be just, why aren't we there yet? Where's this thing? They were clearly lost, probably could not find this platform. And we could see sort of robed figures moving in the mist. We could see them moving in the fog. And I have no doubt that they were there, helping us out, that they were there doing their job and acting as protector spirits. And I know lots of traditions, not just traditions of craft, but lots of traditions have traditional guardian figures. And creating a relationship between the initiate or the member of the group is part of what membership rituals do, so that these kind of spirits can be drawn upon, can be called upon. And that can become very, very helpful later on. So then, of course, we have what people would recognize as the divine, as gods. And in a classical conception, usually what characterizes a god is three things: that they are eternal, that they are omnipresent, in that, like, if Hecate is manifesting at our circle, you can call her to your circle too. And they're the embodiment of a concept and a conduit to the divine with regards to that concept. They can be encountered through a person. You can have the experience of possession, which is a whole discussion unto itself. I have a little paper that I give a talk on possession once a year at UC Berkeley in a class on possessory traditions in South India, comparing that with Wiccan traditions. And so I have a little thing on possession that I could give to Janine, and you could share it if you want, or something like that. But they can also be encountered in embodied form. And I've been fascinated by collecting stories of people who encounter the gods in the flesh. And I had one such encounter when Louisa Tiche, who was the author of the book Jambalaya and is sort of a noted figure in Afro-diasporic traditions, early in her coming to the Bay Area, when she was first establishing herself, she did a workshop on Santeria at a place called Camp Kilowana, which was an old scout camp on the slopes of Mount St. Helena, north of the Bay Area. And it had been taken over by the people who did Shaman's Drum magazine. And she was using that as a site to do this workshop. And it was like a 3-day workshop, two-night workshop. And a friend and I, my friend Sean and I, we'd studied magic together for many years, we'd both been having a bunch of strange coincidences happen in our life that seemed to be pointing to the god Shango. And so we went to this workshop. Figured, oh, well, we should learn something about Shango. So we went to this workshop. And we talked to Louisa about it. And she said, yep, sounds like Shango's trying to talk to you. Sounds like maybe, you should, we're going to do a trance journey tonight into dreams, and you should hopefully talk to him. So we did a number of ceremonies there, all in her tradition, all, dealing with different orishas. And in my case, it was Shango. And the next day, we did sort of strange cross mixture. We did a sweat lodge that was led by the Shaman's Drum people there. And after the sweat lodge, people went sort of wandering through the woods. Now, this place had been used for ceremonies for so many years that you couldn't turn around without finding a little shrine or something dangling from the trees, or, just everywhere. I wonder what happened to people who purchased this place later. But so I was wandering through the woods after the sweat lodge, just sort of, sweat lodge kind of drains you a bit, it's just kind of wandering around. And I started hearing a chant in my head to Shango. And I thought, cool, so I sort of, maybe I'm being given a chant. Isn't that wonderful? So I started singing this chant to myself. Then I heard another voice singing the chant. And up ahead of me, I saw my friend Sean walking through the woods. Now, Sean has gorgeous golden blonde hair going down to his butt. And he was walking up ahead of me, and I could see him, walking ahead, and blonde hair and things. And he was walking ahead of me down through the woods. And he was singing the same song. And I thought, well, has he picked it up from me? Did Shango tell him the same song? Maybe, who knows? So we're walking along, and Sean is ahead of me. He's pushing bushes out of the way. He's pushing branches out of the way for me. But I never seem to be quite able to catch up to him. And finally, I get close enough that I can reach and I can like touch him on the shoulder. And he turns and looks at me, and he has the head of a lion. And I, draw back, and he steps back into the bushes and vanishes. And it later turns out that Sean was an entirely different part of the forest, when this was going on. And the lion is one of the forms that Shango can take. And I told Louisa about this, and I was really pretty floored because spirits I'm used to. I've seen a lot of spirits. I've talked to spirits, etc. This thing was absolutely physically there, moving things, and this was, as far as I know, a god. So that was a fairly potent experience for me. Now, as it turned out, something called the lion-headed god became a very important figure for me in my craft practice going forwards. I did not continue with Shango for a number of reasons involving the problems with being a priest of both that and Wicca at the same time and how complicated that could become. But I know other people who've had such experiences. Gus had an experience on the beach north of here with a woman who I am convinced might have been Yemaya. That was rather amazing and powerful. So I would like to collect more stories of people who have had physical encounters with the gods, because I know they're out there. I've heard them from people, but I got to admit, people don't often share them because you're going to sound kind of crazy. But with this audience, I figure I can get away with it. Then we've got the miscellaneous, and who knows what the hell that is. Let me start with the weird. There's a place in Berkeley called the Greek Theater. It's a big stone amphitheater built into the hillside here that's lots of lectures and graduation ceremonies and rock concerts, all sorts of things have been held there. It's also known for being a strange place after dark and having sort of a weird, uncomfortable reputation after dark. It was one of the places where, when I was first introducing people to the paranormal, I would take them there. And I knew a place to sneak in, and we could go up and sit on the stage, and if we were lucky, something would manifest. Now, something that would manifest more often than other things was a glow that would appear in one of the seats. And if you walked up to that glow, it resolved into something. That's a good point. Anna just mentioned that it's on the Hayward Fault. It resolved into something like a silver glowing Cheshire cat with extremely long claws. Not violent, not aggressive, kind of spooky. And that's it. They would just sit there and look, and we would retreat back. Now, I've taken a number of people up to see that thing, and a number of people have encountered it. I have no idea what the hell it is. It manifests there. It's fine being left alone and is fine showing itself occasionally. Much weirder, up the hill, is a set of labs called the Lawrence Berkeley Labs. And my friend Sean worked there for a number of years. He was a dual physics and mathematics major. And he worked there in nuclear physics. And he would very often find himself there late at night, sort of watching over experiments. And he played the piano. In the auditorium there was a piano at one end of the stage. And so he would stay there. A lot of times it'd be wee hours in the morning, and he would go in there and he'd just play the piano. And he came to me because he said, I'm having a weird experience up there. And this is just above the Greek Theater. He says, there's something very, very strange happening to me, and I want you to see this because it's freaking me out. And I said, well, what? And he said, it's a pig in a tuxedo. And I said, what? And he said, when I'm playing there, I will be playing at the piano, and I will, he wears glasses, and he'd say, look at my glasses. And in my glasses, I would see the reflection of this thing standing behind me. and it's a pig in a tuxedo, standing up with a tuxedo and a hat. And it scares the crap out of me. And so I said, okay, I'll come up. And so I went and stayed up there a couple of nights. Nothing happened. Then one night I was sitting very deliberately up in the high part of the theater, so I wasn't sort of in the way. And Sean was playing, and I loved to listen to him play. And at one point, the place felt funny. It felt colder. And I noticed what seemed to be like sort of a shimmer of the air. Just, something like something's there, like a heat shimmer. And it moved across the stage. And in the middle of the stage was a table with a sink in it, like for presenting experiments. And there happened to be a standalone mic, sitting on it. And this thing walked into the table, just this shimmer walked into the table. And as it reached the microphone, it pushed the microphone ahead of it until the microphone fell into the sink. And then it continued forwards, and it got up just behind Sean when he jumped up and said, "Did you see it? Did you see it?" And I didn't see a pig in a tux, but I saw something. There was something there. Maybe it only presented as a pig in a tux to him. I don't know. But I have no idea what that was. And I don't know why it would present as a pig in a tux to him. There's also one I wanted to bring up because someone is here, Stephanie, you said you're from the San Gabriel Mountains. There's something I've always been interested in. The San Gabriel Mountains are famous for the Watchers, which are tall, dark, standing figures that people see on the ridgeline, on the hilltop in the San Gabriel Mountains. Are you still here, Stephanie? I was hoping she might be willing to say something about it. I think she may have left.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, that's too bad. Okay. Because that's sort of a famous part of California folklore, is people traveling in that area see these figures, just tall, thin humanoid figures standing on the hilltops, just staring, not doing anything. And they're famous. There have been books and poems written about them, the Watchers. So I don't know if she might know anything more about it. No idea what they are. So what to do about them? First off, most astral and nature spirits are harmless and easy to contact or avoid. The others tend to require more effort on both counts, contacting and avoiding. Regarding them, don't contact them frivolously. If you contact a neutral or beneficent spirit, you might just bother or annoy it. If you contact a malevolent spirit, you might seriously piss it off or whet its appetite. If you feel the need to work with such spirits or to address a problematic haunting, I would say first, work with a teacher experienced in working with a variety of spirits and or with an established tried and true tradition or method of working with spirits. Study magical self-defense. And advisably, a certain degree of magical offense is good backup. Gardnerian tradition, among others, have training material on magical self-defense and related arts, and I suggest that you start with whatever your own tradition has to offer and work from there. Understand that good and evil may be relative human terms, but there are still both sheep and sharks in the spirit world. As a general rule, form follows function. If a spirit looks disgusting, it probably is. Don't deal with it. Many entities feed off of, or are at least empowered by, human fear. There was a comic book that I read when I was a kid about, collected ghost stories, and it had the most haunted place in England was the ghost of Berkeley Square in London. And it had a very creepy story with a very creepy drawing of this sort of emaciated hand that was clawing on the wood and making horrible scratching sounds. Years later, when I was investigating a haunting, there was sort of a funny knocking sounds being made from another room. And I commented, well, at least it's not scratching. And the knock immediately became a scratch from the other room. It's like, okay, it's specifically for that reason, So learn techniques to calm and to center yourself. Until you know a particular spirit or class of spirits well, always assume that you should be polite and respectful in your communication. In other words, have both the wand and the athame at the ready. If you're trying to help someone or yourself resolve a haunting, work through these steps. Figure out what's going on, starting with investigation. Once you've made a reasonable determination of what you're dealing with, that is the cause of the haunting, and that it is in fact a supernatural entity of some sort, let this be your guide in how to relate to the spirit or entity. If it appears, based on its manifestation, to be significantly less powerful and skilled than you are, for example, ghosts in the broad sense, most local elementals and nature spirits, be firm and polite, working up to commanding if firmness and politeness doesn't work. If the spirit or entity appears to be roughly comparable to you in power and skill, for example, some classic ghosts, more powerful elementals, reason with it, find out what it wants, what will cause it to leave or calm down, and whatever is the desired outcome. If the spirit entity appears to be significantly more powerful and skilled than you are, for example, most shadow beings, demonic or angelic beings and gods, call upon assistance in the form of your own protectors, gods, and goddesses, or seek aid from other practitioners. Determine if communication is possible, either directly or through something like a Ouija board, mindful of avoiding the yes-no trap. If communication is not possible, banish the spirit and cleanse the house. This should keep it from returning unless there's a specific object, person, or event that allows it to return. A friend of mine, a friend of a friend, lived in a place that had been cleansed repeatedly. One practitioner after another had come on and done one sort of cleansing of the place. And it never took. Weird phenomena and events and people getting sick and other stuff always came back. It turned out over time that not only had the place been built where a cemetery had once been, with no guarantee that everyone had been moved, but there was also a drain running under the house which passed through the property of a nuclear power site. So she had both nasty, crappy waste, possibly nuclear related waste, and a cemetery running under her house. Move away. I mean, there's not much you can do about a situation like that. If communication is possible, determine if the entity can be convinced to leave. They may just require meeting certain conditions to be happy, like my friend Bob's house and his grandmother. Sometimes it's okay for a ghost to stay. Not every ghost has to be exorcised. Or if it's a nature spirit, like hanging out in a yard or a place, perfectly fine to have it stay there. Usually you can work out some kind of accommodations. If the entity is intelligent, unwanted, and determined to stay, you've got a tussle on your hands and moves into the realm of how to deal with, quote, evil spirits. Fortunately, this is rare. Contact a specialist until you have enough experience to take this on yourself. There's almost no good reason to deal with or contact, quote unquote, evil spirits. However, if you are confronted with one, don't panic. Fear often feeds them, and they will do what they can to elicit it from you. Having a companion is great, not just for watching your back, but bucking up your spirits. No pun intended. Stay grounded, centered, and shielded. Few spirits can cause you physical harm, but they can often wreak great psychological or psychic damage. For example, the shadow people, or Astra's experience of the lightsaber. Focus attention and energy away from the spirit onto something antithetical to it. For example, love, or laughter, personal patron deities, etc. Remember that as a witch, you have big guns of your own you can invoke on your behalf. The elemental kings, the mighty ones, the ancestors, the specific protectors of your tradition, and the god and goddess. If the spirit has a clear cultural tie, learn and use the traditional methods of countering said spirit. It's a good idea to be well-versed in these in advance. Salt may be great against one spirit, but be really yummy to another. If it's possible, confronted with a nasty evil spirit, just leave the area. Many spooks are location specific and cannot cross water, doorways, boundaries, etc. If it's not possible to leave the area, cast a circle. On their turf, they have the advantage. But if you've cast a circle, you're on your turf and you have the advantage. Unless you really know what you're doing, don't even try to attack it. In conclusion, as witches or other forms of magical practitioners, our psychic skills are better for detecting what's going on at a haunting than is the ghost tech of the parapsychologists and ghost hunters. Our spiritual knowledge is better for understanding what's going on at a haunting than the virtually non-existent grasping at straws hypotheses of the secular parapsychologists and usually Christian ghost hunters. Our magical abilities are better at dealing with what's going on at a haunting than is the parapsychologists and ghost hunters got nothing. That being said, it's best to approach the world of hauntings cautiously and with guidance. Start with what appears to be relatively benign residual haunts. Even what turns out to be squirrels in the attic's case can teach you about investigative skills before moving on to the more intense, possibly dangerous stuff. Thanks. Any questions? Do we have time for questions? Where are we?
We're at 7:41 right now. We have some folks that are still here. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, raise your hand. I will see if I can see any hands raised. Gus, make sure you take yourself off mute, Gus.
This is not so much a question as an addition. And that is that if you spend some time looking around on Google under the Philip experiment stuff, it's hard to find, but it's still there. And if you can't find it, I made a copy of it.
Oh.
And so you can just let me know, and I'll send it to you. The Philip people did a exhibition at a Toronto television station, surrounded by cameras from just about every angle.
Interesting.
And Philip came through and moved the table, among other things. And given that this was in a television station with cameras on every side, the usual thing of, well, somebody moved the table is only suggesting that Canadians don't have the IQ of a 5-year-old, which I don't think is a valid assumption. So it's a very, very interesting video. Horrible quality reproducing.
That's too bad.
In terms of vision. This is very old. What was the 70s, Don, that they did this?
Yeah, something like that.
And so the quality of the reproduction, it's probably been reproduced and reproduced and reproduced and reproduced.
Yeah.
It sucks, but it's not useless.
Gus was present for a number of the strange adventures I've had doing this.
Yeah, it was. I remember the big thought form as being really big and not as well defined. But we both saw it, and it was pretty damned impressive.
Cool.
At Red, White, and Blue Beach.
Interesting.
And there was an interview, and I've looked for the article and can't find it. And it's probably at Add a Sentence somewhere, because you have the full, all of them, of a Lakota medicine person about what we would call shadow beings. It was very interesting. I was always looking for where different traditions describe the same stuff.
Yeah.
Described exactly the same stuff as best I could say, except they said they were worse. They said avoid them at all costs. Whereas I was curious one night and let him touch me. Don thought I was nuts. And I might have been, but it gave me the theory that when you're in the woods or somewhere and one of these suckers comes by and you get this cold chill, that's the touch. That's the energy extraction. It's
or
what
moving
Don
near
once called psychic mosquitoes. That's all.
Okay.
And this was a wonderful talk. Oh my God, this was a wonderful talk.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Gus. We do have a hand up. Tracy, go ahead. Make sure you're unmuted.
my coven always attended PantheaCon together as a coven. And since we were in the San Jose area, we had talked about, before PantheaCon became no more, we had talked about maybe going and seeing the Winchester House. And I saw the Helen Mirren film, which I'll watch her do anything. I think she's a great actress. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts, comments about the Winchester House. Have you been there? Does it feel weird?
I've been there, and I've been there on the tours, and I just kind of feel like there's so many people going through there constantly that probably not a lot's, it's probably been stirred up way too much for a lot to linger. I tried to arrange to stay there overnight once, and they were like, oh, sure, fine, yeah, we can do that. And they just kept, as the day got closer, they kept placing more and more restrictions on me, so that, like, if I heard something, I couldn't go check it out, things like that. And I'm going like, oh, come on, you're just setting this up so that you can make weird noises, and I'll come out of there saying, yep, it's haunted, but I can't actually investigate anything.
Yeah.
So I called it off. But I don't know. I get very suspicious of places. Not suspicious, that's not the right word. When places become tourist places and there's a constant stream of people running through, I think that probably disrupts what's going on there. It also involves the problem of, with the whole thought form issue, that you also have 1 billion people going through there projecting into it what they think should be there.
Right.
Not just what was there possibly from the beginning. It just becomes a really complicated muddle, I think. But it's a cool place. I highly recommend going.
Okay. Any other questions for Don tonight?
Well, I will. I have one more. I can pass an anecdote. This was, and it did not happen to me, but a friend of mine in Sebastopol told me about it. And it suggests one way of dealing with that supports what Don said about a certain kind of haunting. And Robert was a physicist who taught at Sonoma State. He bought one of the oldest houses in Sebastopol. And he noticed after a while that stuff started moving around, the poltergeist kind of thing. And it pissed him off. So he said he stood in the middle of the living room and yelled, I know you're here. I know you were here before me. But this is my house now. Leave me alone downstairs and you can have the attic. If you don't leave me alone, I'll call an exorcist. Boom. Everything was cool downstairs. And a few years pass. California comes up with a program to encourage more energy sensitive insulation in houses. And so they would give you a grant to add insulation to your attic, whatever. And this old house, the way to get to the attic was through a hole in the ceiling. You just got a ladder and went up. And a woman came by to investigate the house in order to approve or disapprove of the grant. And so Robert said, oh yeah, you go up the attic there and it's right there. And she went up and she was there about 5 minutes and then came running or falling down the ladder and ran out. And Robert went out to catch her and she said, there's something evil up there. And Robert said, no, it's just mischievous. And she said, well, why didn't you tell me? He said, well, I thought if I told you, I'd never get the grant. And I guess it worked. He got the grant. And they later redid the roof and there's nothing there anymore that anybody knows about.
That's a good point I should have added. When people came to me with hauntings and the haunting had only started recently, I would, try to find out, well, what had changed recently. almost always it was renovations.
Yeah.
You know, they'd done something to change the place, change the location, like, you know, moved a big piece of furniture somewhere, or closed off a door, or, you know, added a wing to the house or something. You know, they made some significant change to the material situation.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Another hand up, Mary.
Yeah, I had to get rid of one in a place I rented about 20 years ago.
Mhm.
I had moved in, and the previous tenants had lived there for 26 years.
Mhm.
And she had died at the hospital. He died in his reclining chair in the living room, which didn't bother me at all. I'll move in. I don't care. I'm a witch, you
Mhm.
know.
Right.
But I had two parrots, and my one parrot, her cage was in this corner, and she would just be like, da, 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 and then all of a sudden she would launch herself off of her cage into the middle of the room, going, "Ah," right? So finally, I asked the landlady. I said, "Did Mr. Keller used to was his reclining chair in that corner?" And she said, "Yes." How'd you know? I said, "Just a guess."
Mhm.
So I went in, and I just called him up. The next time that happened, I just went over and I looked at him. I said, "Look, you're not on this plane of existence anymore. We are. That space belongs to my bird. That's where she lives. And if you can't live peacefully with her, I will exorcise you out of here.
Mhm.
You will be gone. So play nice or go away." And it stopped immediately.
You know, I
Was
always wonder if witches can find deals on houses by looking for haunted places.
Usually people that are looking for haunted places end up paying a premium,
Yeah, yeah.
you know, because you want the haunted
That'll be
place.
an interesting real estate firm, you know, hooking up haunted places with people that can clean them. You know?
When I lived in the UK, the last time I lived in the UK, I had friends that owned a 12th century inn right that butted up onto Dartmoor.
Mhm. Oh boy. Okay.
It was amazing. Oh yeah, and they had a grove on their property with a little stream that ran through the west. I mean, it was an amazing piece of property. And she was a witch, and I think he was an asshole, but she was a witch. And
I've encountered that tradition. Yes.
yes, and there that inn is actually listed in haunted inns in the UK, and which I didn't know the first time I stayed there. But I had been up in the middle of the night to use the loo down the hall, and I could hear I couldn't tell if it was a cat meowing or a little girl crying. It was whatever. So I asked him the next morning, I said, "Do you have a cat?" And she said, "Oh, you met the little girl." I said, "A little girl crying. You have a little girl crying." And then she handed me the book and she said, "Yeah, read all about it. It's right here." Like, okie dokie. And that was a common occurrence at that inn.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, but I have found, like, when I run into energies, hauntings, whatever, I'm like, look, either leave or we're going to go at it, you know, and then they don't want to do that with me, pretty much.
You know, one of the real problems I've had with looking into a lot of these things is that it used to be that people didn't know about them, or people that had haunted places would keep them kind of secret.
Mhm.
And now it's like, if you find out a interesting place is haunted, would like to go check it out, they're like, "Well, I think we could book you between the ghost hunters and the ghost adventures." You know, it's like, you know, take a number.
Yeah.
Exactly. You know, you were talking about parapsychologists. I think a lot of the quote parapsychologists that are doing those haunting shows and ghost hunter shows aren't really parapsychologists. I actually have a degree in parapsychology that I got from University of Santa Barbara, which at the time was one of 5 universities in the nation where you could get that degree. The program was run by Dr. Dave Phillips, who has since gone, and you can't get that degree there now, but I got it in like 1982. And we weren't studying ghost huntings.
Right.
Right. what was being studied was out of body, precognition, all of the basic metaphysical things.
Mhm.
And I actually got into that originally as a subject,
Mhm.
and then ended up sticking around, and they gave me credit for all of my volunteer work, and it gave me just enough credits to put me over the top for my degree. So my degree is in parapsychology.
And then parapsychology kind of moved into the ghost hunting field.
Yes, it did,
And
but
it was very strange because it started out one way and then it shifted.
yes.
Um,
Well, I think as they learned more, and the real academics
Mhm.
in that area kind of weren't doing it as much.
Mhm.
It became more commercially based,
Yeah,
Entertainment based.
entertainment based. Yes.
yeah, that's frustrating.
Yeah.
Give me 1 second here. I want to wrap up the recording and thank Don for coming this evening and talking about things that go bump in the night and how to get rid of them or what to do with them, really,
What to do
because
about
there
them.
are some
Mhm.
that are okay to hang around.
Mhm.
And so thank you very much. And I hope that we get to hear another one of your talks very soon.
Mhm.
So thank you, Don, very much.
Sure, my pleasure. Thanks, everyone. It was fun.
This is